Alrighty, okay. So, hello everyone. Welcome to another virtual Kent Digital Meetup Maidstone. For those of you who don't know me, maybe you haven't been here before, I'm Rich Dean and I'm the founder and creative director of Supersonic Playground. We are a WordPress specialist web design agency based here or loosely around Maidstone at the moment. I'm joined tonight by Chantel, who's our marketing executive, and Lindsay, who is our client success manager. And also Ashley is here, one of our designers. So thanks guys for joining and helping me out tonight. As you may have guessed, so tonight's theme is all about UX and UI. Again, we've kind of covered it very early on, but if you're not sure what they are, they basically stand for user experience and user interface design. We'll be getting into that, although obviously there's a lot more than that, so we'll be getting into that in a little while. Pretty much around now, about sort of 5:45, actually, sorry, running a little bit late. I thought we were starting at 5:45, my mistake. But in a minute, we'll do a brief introduction round. I'll come back to that in a minute. Around 6 p.m, we're going to be hearing from our first speaker, which is me, for once. I haven't done one of these for a while, but I'm going to be giving a short presentation on what user experience is and how it can benefit businesses and charities. So my presentation is going to be a bit more of a top level kind of introduction to UX. We're going to then have a short break around about 6:25, so everyone can get up, stretch your legs, go and grab a refreshment for 10 minutes. We'll then come back at 6:35, and then our next speaker is going to be Paul. Paul is CEO at UX24, and Paul's going to be discussing where to start with your UX research plan. So Paul's going to get more into sort of the nuts and bolts of user experience and user research. We're going to be saving our questions until the end of the presentation, just so we stay on schedule and that we break on time. So if you've got any questions, please hold them till the end of the meeting and we can answer them then. As always, we always like to hear from your feedback. So we've got a very short survey that Chantel is going to be sharing in the chat in a moment. If you can just take 2 minutes just to fill that in at some point during the session, it just helps us to make sure these sessions are as good as they can be. I reckon we can jump in. We're a little bit ahead of schedule. So I'm going to jump straight into my presentation. So what is user experience? And why is it important for your organization? So again, just to sort of recap, we've done this, but I'm Rich, I'm founder and creative director at Supersonic Playground. So for about 21 years, just over 21 years, I've been working as a designer. So I've been helping businesses, corporations and charities of all sizes grow their online presence and reap the rewards of having an effective online strategy. So yeah, I've been doing this a little while now. So what we're going to cover in my presentation today. So number one, so what is user experience? This sort of $1 million question, as it were. Dropbox. So we're going to look at Dropbox as a really good example. We're going to look at sort of turning two-way into three-way conversation, which really is a sort of the crux of user experience, what it's actually all about. Look at how we involve users through our web design process. This is when we're working on projects within Supersonic Playground. This is actually how we can involve users through our process. We've got what user experience isn't, so what it's not. And then to answer the sort of the main question, so why is it important for any organization really? So user experience can encompass quite a lot of things. You know, there's a lot of kind of buzzwords and there's a lot of maybe confusion about what user experience is. Is it just kind of button placements and colors? And, you know, I think a lot of people have heard the story about, you know, Amazon moved one of their buttons and it led to X more millions of dollars of sales. And that's part of user experience. There's certainly a lot of kind of buzzwords and sort of buzz terms that kind of go within user experience, things like, you know, design and prototyping, user testing, user research, feedback, surveys, even some of the sort of well, I guess they're not so much buzz terms anymore, they've been around a while, but things like agile methodology and MVP and Scrum. But actually it's quite simple. So basically user experience is about involving your users when you design a new product or service. And it really is actually as simple as that. It's getting users involved and just thinking about their needs, their requirements and what they want and what's going to work for them. I think if you can understand that simple principle, then actually everything else from user experience perspective, UI design, it all kind of makes sense. A lot of people do just focus on the nuts and bolts. They do just focus on, like I said, button placement and mechanics of an interface. And actually user experience is bigger and broader, but it's basically around involving users. So a real world example, you may know this guy, you may not actually, Drew Houston. So he was the original sort of starter or founder and then co-founder of Dropbox. There's actually a really nice story. I don't know if you guys know the story about how and why Drew decided to start Dropbox. He was traveling on a bus in America from Boston to New York. He was a computer programmer by trade, and this was in the sort of the mid 2000s, around about sort of 2006, 2007. And he was a programmer, and back in the day, so he had his laptop, and he wanted to crack on with some project work that he was doing as a developer. But he didn't have his flash stick. So remember those things, flash sticks? He'd forgotten his flash stick. So he's on his bus, he couldn't carry on with his work, and he was really gutted, he was really annoyed with himself. And he basically said to himself, I don't ever want to be in this situation again. So kind of what can we do about it? Now, there were plenty, like the storage market at the time was very saturated, more with your traditional kind of hard drive based storage, like physical storage. But there were still kind of file, kind of, I don't know if you necessarily call them cloud-based at the time, but there were still services out there that were similar. So he definitely wasn't inventing something completely new with Dropbox. But the services that were out there, file sharing services, were very, very clunky, very, very hard to use. So there's the first lead into user experience. But he had this idea of a system that he wanted to sort of start to make work, which he wanted to basically create Dropbox, a very simple, very elegant, efficient system where you could have files on one computer, it would upload them to the cloud and then sync them down to another device somewhere else. He started to kind of do a bit of groundwork and start to sort of develop the software, but he quickly realized it was such a big piece of work to make this software work that he couldn't do it himself. He would need to basically secure funding. He really struggled to get funding because a lot of kind of seed investors were saying, well, there's loads of solutions out there. Why is yours any different? So he couldn't articulate or convey to them why it was a good idea. So actually, he said, instead of actually committing to go and build the software himself, what he did instead was he created a very basic video, right? So he just basically created this video of himself using this. Basically, it wasn't even real software. It was a complete demo. It wasn't even a demo. It was a mock-up, effectively. It was him using this software, basically showing people that might be interested how it was going to work. And he put some in-jokes into this video to sort of make it a bit more comical and satirical for people who are in the industry. He posted it online and said, look, if you think this software is a good idea, just sign up, show your interest in the form below, and we can then hopefully we get enough interest, we can make this thing work. So again, another user experience lead in. He was doing what is basically a very rudimentary MVP, minimum viable product. So a very early way of sort of testing the water to see if the thing would work, which again is the fundamental crux of user experience. It's about testing to see if the thing will work. Almost overnight, he received sort of about 75,000 signups. Not literally overnight, but within a very short amount of time. And that was huge. And that gave him the confidence. He could now go to these investors and say, look, I've got a proof of concept. I've got a very initial, very rudimentary prototype. We've got 75,000 people plus who have already shown interest in this software. Will you give us the funding? The rest is history. He grew it. And in, I think, July 2020, it was latest valued at, sorry, I've missed my bullet points. Yeah, so just kind of freestyled. Overnight, it was valued, July 2020, $9 billion. So that's a really good success story of how kind of very early user experience, user testing helped to get a company off the ground and then take it through. And they say, and it actually says since that they basically, that whole ethos of minimum viable products, testing early, getting something to market very quickly, although nowadays it's very much an accepted way of doing things. Back then, when he started Dropbox in the late 2000s, it was a very new concept, but they do that right to this day. So how I tend to look at it is it's about turning two-way conversation to three-way conversation. So what that generally means is, in the world of design, in a very basic sense, on a normal relationship, so a design agency like Supersonic Playground, when we're creating a website for a client, in most cases, the basic level of conversation is two-way, and that is between us, the agency, and our client. Okay, so we'll come to the picture, we'll come on board with our expertise and experience of creating websites. So if the client's looking to build a new website, create a new website, and we're doing that for them, we will come into the picture. Our side of the conversation will be that we'll be able to advise on what works online. So what makes a good website, what works in terms of that user interface, the experience, our expertise and opinions based on that. The business, the client, they come into the conversation and they give their insight and expertise on their business. So what kind of business do they run? What do they know about the users at that point? What they know about their products? Normally they know a lot more about their products than actually they know about their users, but they won't always admit it. And it's very much a two-way conversation. And that, as much as we'd love to have more of a user experience input in most projects are like that. That's a general kind of the way the projects work. But where possible, where the client has a budget, we want to turn it into a three-way conversation, which is basically where we involve the users. Which sounds quite simplistic, but actually when you bring the users into the conversation and switch it from this two-way to this three-way conversation, quite often some magical things can happen. So when we're bringing in the users, they can advise us. So, you know, if we're involving the users in our designs, our prototypes, our websites that we're creating, they'll quite often tell us stuff that we didn't even realize or that we didn't even factor in there. We will design the thing in its best a way that we can. But until you actually test anything with a real world user, you never know for certain if it's going to resonate, if it's going to land. Likewise for the business, you know, quite often businesses, our clients, and even not even businesses, we do a lot of work with charities, they're often quite surprised by what the users tell them. You know, they may think their business is conveying a certain message. It's really obvious what they do, but quite often we've done user experience testing and user research, and quite often the users come back with stuff about the business or the charity that actually they didn't realise. You know, they're not conveying clearly what they do. They're not getting across their message really well. So bringing the users into that conversation is quite a paradigm shift. Sadly, we don't get to do it as much as we'd like on projects because quite often clients are on a limited budget, and user experience design and testing and research, you know, it can unfortunately cost money, and not all clients can afford to pay for that. What does that kind of look like in the real world? So when we bring users into the picture, you know, what can that look like, you know, for something like a website? So this is how we normally break down our web design process. So we do still do a bit of what we would call user experience design, but on a basic level, at the very basic level. So we'll start off with wireframes. What are wireframes? Wireframes are a little bit like architect's blueprints. So they're basically bare box layout, structural layouts of what each template or page on a website will look like. And if we can, we'll do that across mobile, tablet, desktop. They're very rudimentary. You know, there's no color, typography, image treatments, illustrations. It's just purely the bare basic layout and content structure of a page. But they're really valuable. The reason we do it that way is because it enables both the client and potentially users to focus on the core structure and the intent of the page, without getting distracted by things like colours, because that can actually be quite a distracting thing. And it also means that, yeah, again, it enables the client to focus on the content and structure without getting distracted. When the client's then happy with the wireframes and they sign that off, we'll then move on to visual design, which is basically we take those wireframes. We then either create a new brand, because we do actually create branding as part of our offering, or we'll take an existing brand and we'll then apply it to the wireframes. There's a bit more to it than that. I'm kind of doing it a bit of disservice, but we will look at typography, typefaces, font options, illustration styles, color palette, color treatments, photography styles, and we'll take those wireframes, very much bring them to life through visual design. We'll do different look and feel options to kind of give the client and the users options about which one works the best. When the client's then happy and they've approved the visual designs, we'll then basically move on to the development stage, which is kind of this area over here. We build a customized WordPress backend. Then we basically work on the front end development, which is basically we take what WordPress outputs and we style it up so basically it looks and works like the visual designs and it's fully responsive and quick to load. Even the user experience in the admin area, you know, when we're doing the WordPress backend, it's not just about the front end. You know, we'll make the WordPress backend work really efficiently and streamlined for our clients. So a bit of a sales pitch there, I'm aware, sorry about that, but that's our normal kind of end-to-end when we're designing and building a custom WordPress website. But what we do know is where can we bring in user experience? So if we can involve the users, we'll try and involve them at every stage possible. So even before we get into this phase, the wireframe phase, we can look at effectively, when we build a website, and the same with software, when you're developing software, this kind of key, this development stage is probably the most labor intensive, and it's also the most critical. So if things aren't working or resonating for the user here, that's when it's most costly to improve. But if we involve the users through our design stage, so if we involve them right from the start, so for example, and even before we actually begin wireframes, we can look at, well, what user research pieces can we do even before the project begins. So we can look at, even before we get started, before we open a design piece of software, we can look at user research. So involving the users, so that could be telephone interviews. So phoning up users and actually asking them, okay, so maybe how have you dealt with this client in the past? What do you think of this client? What's the impression that you get of them? What do they do? Have you used their existing website recently? If you have, i.e. if we're replacing it, what did you go to the website to do? Were you able to complete that task? Were there any blockers or anything that stopped you doing that task? What would you like to have seen on the website that wasn't there? And lots of other questions we can get a good insight from existing users even before we just start design. Once we then speak to a good pool of users, if we speak to, say, maybe 20, 30, 50 different users, we can start to look at persona generation. So what are the personas? So we could say, right, well, persona number one is Mike, and he's maybe a 50-year-old husband. He's got a family. He wants to achieve this from the website. Or Sally is a sort of a 25-year-old. She's career-driven. She wants to do this. What are her goals? What are her needs from the website? We can look at competitors. What are the competitors doing? Do some research analysis on that. What are the other competitors doing? What is working well for them? What isn't working well? We can use a test the existing, if we're replacing a website, we can use a test that existing website. So get users involved and actually kind of test it and look at them in the real world, i.e. when we say user testing, we're literally talking about getting users on a computer and asking them to do tasks and actually monitoring them, how they perform that task. We can do technical testing, so look at using tools like Google Analytics, Hotjar, actually looking at how people are using the site from a sort of technical and data perspective. And then when we get into the wireframe stage, we can look at, right, once we've got our wireframes completed, let's get the users involved and get the users to test these wireframes. Again, let's get them to do some tasks to test them and validate them, make sure they're working. Let's look at the navigation structure. Does that make sense? Quite often clients will name things in a very niche way that may make sense to the client, may not make sense for the user. And any feedback that we get from the user during this work, we then put that back into designs, into improving them. We can do the same thing in the visual design phase. User research, test, as much testing as we can do will ensure that we're capturing any potential issues. Feedback gained equals less changes in the future as well. And then once we get into the WordPress backend development, even hopefully our user testing during the design phase will have covered off any potential issues. But again, we can do the same. So once we get to an MVP, once we get to like the basic, the development site's finished, we've got some real world content, we've got a working prototype, we can go back into user testing. So test it again now that the thing's built. And again, we can loop that back, create that feedback loop it back, and make sure that the thing that we launch is as good as it can be. And even after launch, there's this misconception that once you launch a website, it's finished and that's it. It stays as it is for the next 2 or 3 years and then you replace it. Well, no, actually, get it into the real world, but then continue to monitor it. User behavior can change. 6 months later, new technologies can come in, new ways of doing things, browser updates, new trends. It's an ongoing thing. So if you can factor in a budget for ongoing user testing, so make sure you're always testing your website and then feeding back and making changes, that's really powerful and will help to make sure that your website lasts as long as it can and has the most impact. So what user experience, what isn't user experience? So there's some really important points here. So it's not a silver bullet or panacea, okay? So it's not the solution to everything. It's good at giving you data, but it's not, you still need to take everything you have or everything you get from user experience and research and testing and with a bit of a sort of pinch of salt, always kind of look at the context and read between the lines. It's not about delegating creativity or innovation to your users. So it's not a get out of jail free card. It's not a way of letting them come up with the ideas for you. It's a way of basically, you still have to create and innovate yourself. User testing is a way of basically validating that. It may replace theory or assumptions with empirical evidence. It will get over this kind of, sometimes with clients, a client might like blue. or the client's wife's dog's uncle's cousin likes pink. It gets past that, so it definitely replaces a lot of those assumptions and theories with more empirical data, more empirical evidence, i.e., you know, well, 30 people have said they like green, so we recommend going with green. But even then, you are still dealing with people's opinions, i.e. your users, it's still their opinions, you're still dealing with humans. So it definitely still isn't 100% pure hard data. There's a very famous saying, which a lot of research suggests, actually Henry Ford didn't actually say this, but we associate this saying with Henry Ford, founder of the Ford Motor Company. If I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Again, there's a lot of research now that suggests he didn't actually say that, but it's still a very valid point. I do like it quite a lot because it's true. It's, you know, people know what they know and they don't know what they don't know. Before the motor vehicle was invented, people were used to horses. If you'd said to someone, what do you want? They wouldn't have thought of a car because it's quite a paradigm shift. They would have just said faster horses. So it's worth remembering stuff like that. And just to answer finally the original question we asked, why is it important for your organization? So, you know, imagine if you were launching a new product or service without properly testing it with your users. You know, flying blind is a bit of an understatement. Now, what a risk that could be, especially if you invest a lot of money. And actually, the more money you invest, the more risk you're taking. Though, you know, a website for us, when we're designing websites for clients, you're looking at spends anywhere from sort of 3 or 4 grand upwards to around about sort of 10 to 15k, which is still a chunk of money, but in the grand scheme of things, when you're talking about software development or app development, you know, if a business has got the next big idea, the next big Facebook, and they're looking to invest 100 grand on a customized piece of software, that's quite a risk, you know, to even think about, you know, designing that thing completely without even testing it with the users and then launching it and risking 100 grand, launching a solution that doesn't resonate, it doesn't land and bombs. That's where user experience research and testing is absolutely gold. As I said, it reduces the risk, you know, of launching that solution that doesn't resonate. And the good thing is, it can be used at any stage of the project. So even if you're, you know, you're 95% of the way through a project, and you think, oh my goodness, we haven't even thought about researching with users, you can still add it on. It can be used, like I said, before, middle, end, and even afterwards. And it's never too late to start. And it doesn't need to cost a fortune. Like, yes, there's lots of things you can do. They can be quite time consuming, but there's lots of guerrilla ways that you can involve users. You know, ultimately, like I said, the big thing to finish on is user experience is about reducing risk. That's basically what it is. So thank you. Hopefully that was cool and everyone enjoyed that. Over to you, Paul.
Okay, well, firstly, thank you to Rich and Chantal for inviting me to speak, and Mark Rose for connecting me. It's very kind of you, and I'm always very happy to talk about UX research because it's something I'm very passionate about, and the more people who know about it and the more people who do it, the better it is for everybody, because there are still, despite the fact that, as you will see in my presentation, this bit has been around a long time, there are still a lot of really bad user interfaces out there, and we all suffer because of it. So I'm Paul. I founded UX 24/7. We're actually called UX 24/7 because you can't get away from experiences in the digital world. They are always on, and even if you've left the office at night having finished polishing your beautiful design, the users are going to carry on using it wherever and whenever they want to. And so that's kind of where we fit in. And what I'm going to talk today about is really building on Rich's presentation, but about, okay, he's talked a lot about user testing and user research, but what does that mean? What do you actually do if you're going to do that? So oh, look at that, can't even control the slides. Let me just, there we go, right. So to start off with and just reiterate, why do we do it? This is a letter my wife and I received from my daughter Lucy, our youngest daughter, when she was about 7. And if you can't read it very well, it says, "To Mum and Dad, I would like you to take my stupid huddle back to where you got it, because I literally want to throw it down the stairs and smash it. By the way, I hate my huddle, from Lucy." And for anybody who bought a huddle for their child or for themselves, they'll know that there were a lot of user interface issues with that. And that's really why we exist. I can't imagine they did any research. So what I'm going to talk about today is three things really. One is the most used UX research method. It fits in so many places through the product development cycle in slightly different forms, but it's fundamentally the same kind of a thing. Secondly, I'm going to talk about UX research DIY. So if you can't afford to do it, and as Rich said, it can be quite expensive, particularly with small projects where you're spending £10,000 on a website, the research alone could cost more than that. So how do you do more of it yourself if you can't afford to get somebody to come in and do it for you? And then finally, whether you're doing it yourself or whether you're bringing an agency in, a little UX checklist with a few sort of just tips that you can take to your own interface. In the back of the deck, I've also provided a bunch of links. Well, one is sort of the list of the checklist, but also a bunch of links to various resources, some on our website, but some external resources that just support the checklist and other bits in this deck. And I think Chantal has a link to where we've uploaded it online, so you can get that if you want. And I put my email in the chat as well, so you can ping me if you want it. So the most used method, it has many names. I mean, when I got into the industry 20 odd years ago, it was usability testing. That was the thing. It's called many things: usability evaluation, user testing, user research, UX research, and lots of other things in between. And if you talk to a practitioner, they mean different things. I mean, UX research and usability testing, they are kind of different things. But generally speaking, if you hear these terms mentioned out and about, they're referring broadly to the same thing, and that is putting your users, customers in front of an interface or in front of a proposition and having them give you feedback about it, whether that's verbal or whether that's because they're attempting tasks. And what that looks like, or what it used to look like pre-pandemic, was a lot of the stuff on the right-hand side of this slide. So we spend a lot of time in UX research labs with clients, peering through the glass at our moderator, working with the participants who'd be offering feedback. Pre-pandemic, we were actually doing a lot of online research anyway, but now all of it's online. I think it'll go back to some lab-based. But the picture on the bottom left gives you a hint of that. And we do a lot of research where the user joins online, they share their interface. It might be a prototype we've sent them, or we host it, share it, and then they interact with it. And they give us feedback, and we really want to see their face and their expressions as they're using it, hear what they've got to say, and see how they interact with it. And top left in the slide, you can see this sort of picture of in-field. And it's really to illustrate the fact it doesn't have to be in a lab, it doesn't have to be online. We do research in stores with point of sale equipment. We do it in people's homes, what we did before the pandemic. You can do it all over the place. And it's really just about finding ways to get your users involved in developing your digital products. So to answer the question that was posed earlier by one of you guys about the Tesla, and is the user interface there? That's a user interface? Yes, it is. And in fact, user experience research or usability research goes back a long way. One of the earliest incidents was in the Second World War by Alphonse Champagny, an American pioneer of industrial design, where really talked about pilot error, and this is where the term came from. They started looking at the ergonomics of airplane cockpit design. And Alphonse is really considered one of the fathers of human factors, which is where a lot of this stuff comes from. And then sort of moving along chronologically, you've got Bell Labs, who used to be, well, Bell Telephone Labs. 47 was when they hired their first psychologist to design a telephone system, which was very unusual. Obviously, psychologists didn't really get involved in product design before that. And psychology underpins a lot of what we do in user experience research, because we're looking for those micro interactions, those moments of consternation when people are perhaps saying one thing but clearly frustrated, or there's high cognitive load when they're trying to attempt something. So there's a lot of psychology in what we do. Moving through, you've got the sort of Human Factors Society that was founded in '57, and that has got 4,500 members now. Also formative and summative. These are research methods that formative was coined because it talks about forming and shaping the design, and summative is about determining issues, so more evaluative. 79 saw the first permanent usability lab at IBM. Then that was followed very quickly by the think aloud method, and that's something we use all the time in usability testing in particular, where we ask a participant to think out loud, to express their what they're thinking and feeling as they're attempting the different tasks and experiencing the interface perhaps. Then there was a book published, The Human Factor by Richard Rubinstein. That was the first book really about designing computer systems for people. And then that was really followed by Jakob Nielsen, you see here, and also his colleague Don Norman, who Don Norman in fact coined the phrase user experience back in '88. But Jakob Nielsen wrote the first book that really talked about usability engineering. And in fact, I have a copy of his later book. Oh, look, you can't see that because of the blue background, but his later book is called Designing Web Usability. And that one you'll find on a lot of shelves all over the place. And then finally, in sort of 2000, the timeline here is Steve Krug, who created the first kind of common sense approach to usability, a book called Don't Make Me Think. And that was really widely read, and that was really when the internet was becoming a big thing, or web was becoming a big thing, and it exploded and really helped to get usability testing on people's consciousness, or in people's consciousness. So things have moved along a lot since then, and Rich talked about when to do it, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. This is a framework that is really helpful, I think, for understanding that, and it's the Design Council's product development framework called the Double Diamond. And what it talks about is these two diamonds that go through the diverging and converging stages. And they start at the far left with discovery. And they talk about solving problems, but in many ways what they mean by that when you're thinking about product development is establishing and understanding perhaps unmet needs or problems that people have that they don't necessarily know there's a solution for. And that speaks to Rich's point about Ford and faster horses. People don't necessarily know what they want, or they can't articulate what they want, but they can articulate these unmet needs and these problems if you get them involved in research. So the divergent stage is really about sort of expanding you think you've got a proposition, but expanding the sort of field of research as wide as you can to really get under the hood of that and really lock it down. And then you go into the convergent stage where you're defining actually, well, what's the solution going to look like? And then the second diamond is really about developing the product, with the first part diverging, again, looking at creating concepts and prototypes to really try and work out what's going to be the perfect solution for this product, what's going to form the product. And then finally, the convergence stage was really getting into the point, again, Rich talked about with the hard coding of the back end and the front end, because we're really getting into that kind of, we've made our decision now, and we're really honing down. So when can user research, usability testing have a role? Well, for us, all we do, by the way, is UX research or design research. So we work from the very beginning of the problem, all the way through the solution. But for the vast majority of people, the bit they engage with in usability testing is in this second diamond. And that's because we're starting to develop prototypes here, we're developing visual design, and usability testing has a huge amount of value here. And it's the reason most people do it here is because if you're a relatively immature organization in user experience, then this is where it kind of adds the most value, and it's where it's most easily understood, actually, because you've got a prototype, you put users in front of it, they tell you what's wrong with it, you fix it, improve it, and on you go. And it's a very effective method, and it's why it's the most commonly used. So what are we looking for when we're doing this kind of research? And in fact, Rich talked about opinions. We're actually not looking for opinions. We will get opinions quite often, but we're not looking for those. And particularly with usability testing, we're looking for facts. We're looking for where people have problems. What usability testing can uncover in particular is things like interaction problems, where a button doesn't work or a form doesn't work in the way the user would expect it to work. Also with copy and tone. Quite often, and particularly in the early days, it's getting better now, but it's still really prevalent. Not many organizations have a UX copywriter, and copy is different online, and so there can be real problems with copy and tone where the brand guidelines are written for offline and then just sort of hijacked to be used online. We're also looking for key pain points. What's going on in the interaction and the experience? Where do people have real problems? How do we fix that? Mismatches in mental models. That's a hell of a mouthful, but what we're really meaning there is how do people, how does what we design fit in with the mental model? And in fact, we can find this quite often where a customer's come up with a way of talking about something or explaining something, and then when we go into testing, actually the customer doesn't think about that thing in that way at all, and we've got to sort of unravel that and work out, well, how do they think about it? We're also looking for flaws in the proposition, and that's particularly true if the first time we've done usability testing or UX research is at the second diamond stage, because if they haven't done any research before, quite often the customer will have come up with an idea, they'll have charged through the first two stages in the first diamond, and then they've built something. And quite often then when we put it in front of users, there are flaws in the proposition. It doesn't quite meet what the customer's unmet need is or what their problem space is. And so sometimes they've got to go a little bit backwards to go forward. And then also incorrect audience assumptions. Again, Rich mentioned personas, which is a tool we use a lot, but some customers don't have a very clear idea about who their audience is. And so when you actually get the interface in front of them, you start to realize, we've got this audience slightly wrong, and what we've done is slightly wrong. So that's what we're looking for. How many users are we interested in testing with? Well, this changed quite a lot. Actually, when Jakob Nielsen wrote his book, this graph was written with 8 users at the point of 85%. And as you can see now, it's hovering around the 5 users. This is the bottom axis here where we've got number of test users. And that was really Steve Krug in Don't Make Me Think. He said 5 users was enough. And what this graph is showing is that on the left-hand side, it's the percentage of usability problems we're going to find in research. And what happens as you get beyond 5 users, you get diminishing returns. And so actually, there's no point in running research with 15 users for usability testing. We're much better off running with 5 and then making some changes and running with 5 again and making some changes and running with 5 again. So that's the way we tend to operate. This is 5 users for an interface. So of course, these days we've got desktop screen sizes, we've got mobile, tablet. So we want to really cover off each of those because they are different. But that's the kind of principles we're looking at here. Right, so that's kind of what it's all about. Next, I'm going to talk about, so if you want to do some yourself, what do you do? I'm obviously going to run over, by the way, Rich, so thank God you were quicker. I can already see my timer here. So the core components of UX research, there are really 4 elements to it. It is very, very simple. There's the subject, which could be the proposition, the prototype, the website, whatever it is, the digital product, can be even a service layer these days. The difference between off and online is really not as distinct as it used to be. There's then the users or the customers, the participants, and who we're going to get in the room or online to test it. The next is the location. So where are we going to run this research? Are we going to do it as an online Zoom session, or are we going to go to someone's house? Are we going to get them into your office? Are we going to get them into a lab where you can sit behind the glass? And the 4th piece is the time or the effort involved in running the research, whether that's an agency, whether that's yourself, in the planning of it, in the organization, in the moderation, in the analysis and the reporting. And those are the components that make up a research project. What I want to show you here is our process. So if anybody asks for a proposal from us, that this is what they would see in it, because it's a useful illustration about how a research project runs. And there are 6 stages here to the project. The first one is really about the objectives, which is sitting down with the client, working out what do they want to get out of this. So if you're doing the research yourself, you go through exactly the same process. I've got a prototype, or I've got a website. What's my objectives? What do I want to learn? What am I trying to do as a result of the data I'm going to get here? What are the research questions I want to ask? All of that will go into a discussion guide. You'll create tasks. You know, if you've built an e-commerce website, the task might be a browse and buy task, or a search and buy task. If it's a mortgage application, it might be a going through the mortgage application process, filling out a form. But you'll have an idea of what that is, and you'll be giving tasks or scenarios to people, and that's what the planning stage will deal with. It will also deal with things like the devices that they're going to use. If you've built an app, it might be, we want to test it on Android because that might be the only version of it you've built. It might be on iOS. Again, you might do desktop, you might do PC, mobile or tablet. We're also then going to think about the participants. So you might do guerrilla testing. That could be just go down to a cafe, buy a load of people a coffee and get them to have a look at your thing because you've got it on a laptop and you can get them to have a play with it. It could be more involved than that, where you're actually recruiting participants from a field recruitment agency. You're getting them to come in. They'll be recruited against your profiles. We use a screener for that, which is a document designed to ask open questions that don't lead the person to respond in a particular way, so that we can really understand, are they the type of person that meets the profile we want. You're also going to have to pay them, by the way. If you don't buy them a coffee, you know, participants can get a £50 incentive. For B2B customers, it can, you know, be £100, £200. It can be very, very expensive. For international research, if you go into the US, it can be more than that. We're doing a project at the moment where it's $350 for a 90-minute session. So it can be very expensive to run research just on the incentives alone. The next bit is the UX research, so the moderation, the interview, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Then the next stage, once you've done those sessions, taking out your observations, identifying the issues, coming up with solutions. That's your analysis stage. And then finally, how you report those back. And that could be in a big report, or it could just be, if you're doing it for yourself, you might actually just make the changes to the prototype or the interface as you go. It could be you do a workshop with your own team or with your designers. So if you're going to run the research, there are a number of things you've got to, skills you've got to have to do it. You don't have to have all of these, but this is really going to give you the best outcome, I think. And you can adopt these behaviors if you're not, you know, a trained researcher. That's okay. You can adopt these behaviors, but these are things to think about. I think one, it's important to have good digital literacy. If you're going to have people interfacing with your, testing your interface, you really need to understand what the impact of what they're telling you is and what to do about it. We've seen plenty of interfaces get worse rather than better because the customers implemented poor solutions to the problems that have been identified. So it is important to have good digital literacy. The good news is there's a lot of information online these days, and you can find solutions if you hunt hard enough. You've got to be a good listener. And you've got to be a good listener, because when we talk about creating tasks and discussion guide, these are guides to what we're going to do, and we've got to be able to listen to what the participants are telling us and be able to react to that, because we will learn a lot more if we do. We don't want to just follow the script and drive them down a path. We really want to try and allow them to interact as naturally as possible, and that means you've got to listen. You need a lot of empathy, particularly if it's your design, actually, or if you're an agency and you've built it, or even if somebody else has designed it. And that's because you've got to put yourself in the shoes of the user. They may have, they may identify things that you hadn't thought of, and you might not actually believe are real issues. And you've really got to have empathy to kind of go with that and see whether that builds up, particularly because if you're doing 5 or 6 people, that data is sort of built up in layers over time. And it's really important to have empathy as you go through and understand that these things are real for these people. And it goes without saying, you're going to have good concentration. These are often 60-minute sessions for usability testing, can be 90-minute sessions for discovery research, and you've got to really hang on every word. It's really, really tiring. So you've got to have good concentration. So hopefully that doesn't sound too hard, but if it does feel a bit easy, then there's a few other things to be aware of. One not talked about is the sort of concentration. It is 60 to 90 minutes. Every insight has to be created as valuable, even if you've heard it 6 times. What we can't do is if you know the 6th or 5th participant says the same thing, we can't go, oh yeah, we've heard that, come on, move on. It's just as valuable. We've got to keep them engaged, so we've got to react to that appropriately. We do have to be ready for participants not sticking to the script. Sorry, someone's come to the door. I've got dogs. I hope that's not disturbing you too much. And we do get these kind of special participants, like as the picture kind of shows here, that are a bit sort of different to what we expect, but they all represent potential personas we have, and we have to be ready for those. The worst ones by a long way are participants who won't talk, and they're just not natural talkers, even if we encourage them to do think aloud. And you've got to be ready for that, have little exercises to get them to talk, get them in the right frame of mind. So that's important. But if you get it right, the benefits are enormous. There is nothing like if you talk to people who've been in research for the first time, seeing their customers interact with their product, they'll talk about it forever. You know, it's just a really fascinating experience, and there's nothing like it. You just can't replace it with anything else. So what if you don't have the resources? So Rich covered this in his presentation when he talked about the development process and wanting to get people in on the wireframe stage. And really this, when somebody says to me, well, we haven't got much money or we haven't got much time, where should we do research? I always pull out this bias and Mayhew graph, because it really illustrates the point perfectly. And what it does is show that as we go through the development process, the number of possible design alternatives diminishes and the cost of making changes goes up. And if we think about it, taking Rich's example there, if you're creating wireframes, you could create a wireframe just as a paper pencil drawing. And of course, any changes we make to that are cheap and easy. We can rip that up, throw it away, and just draw another one. By the time it's hard coded in the back end or the front end, any change we're going to make at that point is going to be expensive. And the likelihood is, in my experience, those changes don't get made. What happens is it gets launched and they go in the revision 1 bucket, and maybe they get changed down the line. So really, if you can only do a little bit of this, you really want to do it before you are going to have to make a decision not to make the changes because it's too expensive. So get it in as early as you can. So hopefully that's given you a bit of a flavor of if you want to do it, how you go about it. And this is very quick, so obviously if you've got questions, we can answer those later. Finally, I want to cover off a few sort of tips for the UX checklist. 10 quick tips here. The first one is, I'll just have a drink of water. The first one is to remember mobile and desktop. This might sound a bit stupid actually, but we went through this phase where obviously originally there was only desktop and tiny screens and you know, pixels and what have you. And then mobile came along and there was a massive mobile first movement. And really during that period, a lot of people forgot about desktop, and you ended up with these wide open spaces on big screens that weren't really very well designed. That really damages the user experience. So when you're looking at your designs, think about all of the different form factors that your customers use. You might not have many tablet users, that's okay. Responsive design is really great now. It can move these things in, but of course, you know, things that layer into columns on mobile can dump really important content very low down a column. And if you leave that to your designer, that's really imparting the strategy on them if they haven't tested that with users. So have a good think about, well, what would users want to do here? Where should that content come? And similarly for the desktop, what's the hierarchy here? How is that space used? This really makes sure we think about all of the interfaces, not just one. Inclusivity, remember to be inclusive. Accessibility has been talked about for years and it's still a problem. A lot of organizations don't deal with it. This is from testing just last year for one of our clients. And this is from a color contrast checker. When you can get these tools, they're free online. And the little screen grab here of the copy is basically, they have this little call out that says easy size reference, check out the, and then it's got various text in this very light blue. And they thought they were highlighting this text. And as you can see, when that color is put in the color contrast checker, it fails all accessibility levels, even when it's in very large text. Now, you might say, well, we don't have many blind customers, but you'd probably be wrong. Most people who have sight issues don't even qualify as being disabled. And particularly if you've got an aging audience these days, you know, I wear glasses, people online, they struggle with small text, poor visual differentiation. So have a good think about it. If you've got anybody who is particularly over 50, the likelihood is you're going to have to be thinking about them from a visual point of view, but also probably from a cognitive point of view. If they're shaking hands, you know, they might not be able to touch or click on a tiny little icon. So think about that and be inclusive in your design. When you're creating journeys, create linear journeys. We see a lot of time people have got very complex sort of ideas about journeys and user journey design. Try not to do that. Try and keep it as linear as possible. People think in linear ways. Most people go from step to step to step. It's the way they've been taught online. So if you can, try and keep a nice linear flow. Make the task simple for the user. So whenever you get a page of your design, think about the objectives of that page and try and keep it as clear as possible to the user in terms of what is the one or two things you want them to do. Don't give them lots of things to do because that will confuse them. So what's the one or two decisions you want them to take? If possible, a single clear call to action. That can get really tricky on multi-channel e-commerce sites, in particular these days, where they want to give you lots of different options for how you're going to get things delivered, whether you pick it up or deliver or whatever. But wherever possible, a single clear call to action, hierarchical call to action. So it's very clear what's the thing you want them to do. Yodel here does a really good job of that, actually. Avoid making users repeat themselves. This is done really well now in e-commerce, you know, where you're, yeah, my billing address is the same as my delivery address. But there are lots of opportunities through the design process where you can think, am I making the user repeat something we should already know? Because that's the feedback we will get in user testing all the time is, oh, I've already given them this information. Why are they making me do this again? So if possible, think about that first and try and design that in. Anybody who writes copy will hate this one, but delete 50% of the copy. I've not sat in any usability testing where the copy has been read. Users don't read copy. They scan it, they look for bullet points. Your beautiful prose are just not going to get read. So if you can do anything to help yourself, when you've written something, cut it in half, try and edit it down to the key information, because it will have a bigger impact and it will be better interacted with by users. I've touched on this already, and actually I could do a whole talk about the paradox of choice. But there's some great stuff. There's a fantastic TED talk by Barry Schwartz on the paradox of choice. And really the whole idea of this is that the more choice you offer someone, the harder it is for them to make a decision. So when you're designing, try not to give too many choices. We talked about one or two decisions in one of the tips earlier on, but take that a bit further. Really try, you know, even in product choices, we're being taught a little bit by Amazon about, you know, oh, people who bought this, bought that, and there can be 20 different choices. That is too much for users. They want less choice, actually, and it makes decision making much easier for them if they get less choices to make. Try and think about the mistakes that a user might make and prevent them in the design. So this is a very easy example. We've all input credit card numbers into websites, I'm sure. And it's very easy to have a system that breaks that number down into 4 blocks, which is how it is on the credit card. And that also helps a user input it more accurately and stops them making errors. But there are lots of things we can do. Make, you know, this form here, the CVV number box, it's the size that's relevant to the task. quite often we see massive boxes for tiny information and vice versa. And there are lots of different ways we can think about how a user might make a mistake. So try and put yourself in their shoes and test your designs for, okay, how would they go wrong here? And how can we stop that happening? And my final tip really is don't mark your own homework. So although I talked about do your own research if you've got to, if you're absolutely the only person, then do it yourself. But if you have made the design, far better if you can to get someone else to have a look at it. And I showed you the little thing from my daughter, Lucy. This is her as a little baby. And this is the thing, I think she's beautiful, of course, because she's my daughter. And when you've created your own design, that's what you will see, this beautiful thing that you've created. And it's very hard to be objective. But actually, when you put it in front of research, this is what others see. And this is actually my son, James, who's not so attractive by any means. So to try and get somebody else to do it for you, because they'll be much more objective, and you'll find that just easier to take on board. So I'm not going to go through this. This is takeaway in there. So if you want the deck, I think Chantal can share it with you. And there's links here to the TED Talk from Barry Schwartz and various other bits and bobs, the double diamond from the Design Council and what have you. Those are my contact details. If you want to get in touch, please do.
Excellent. Thanks, Paul. That was amazing. Really, really cool. So well, I'm just going to jump off and just... I'm sure we're going to have some questions. So let me just, I'm just going to share my screen onto the final slide. Can you guys see my screen okay?
Yeah.
The right one, where it says break. User experience of Zoom is not that great. You can't all see yourselves on my screen, can you?
No, we can see the right screen.
So, has anyone got any questions?
Yeah, I've got a question. Rich, fantastic presentations from both of you. Thank you for that. Paul, it's been a while since we worked together, but a lot of what you say is still salient, still relevant. And one of the biggest issues we've always faced with user experience is, especially user research, is getting the customer to buy into it. Now, I think there's a few digital agencies and people that are involved in digital on the call, and we all know that customers don't want to spend money. So has there been any further evidence around how to quantify the value of user experience testing and research?
That's a really good question, Mark. There is, I mean, you're right, it is hard to convince people at times to do it. But luckily for us, and I think increasingly actually these days, organizations actually, I think with the rise of customer experience in the kind of vocabulary, organizations have started to build their strategy on good user experience. So if you take organizations like Shopify, for example, who provide e-commerce platform software, they are building beautiful and easy to use product, and it is their strategy. And what that does is force other organizations to think about what they're doing, because they fall behind, because these organizations do very well. To answer specifically your question, there is information on the ROI from this kind of thing. We've got a page actually on our website, if you hunt it out, where there's a bunch of links to sort of ROI calculators and other bits and bobs that help. But yeah, there is evidence. And in fact, there's a case study on our website as well from My Home Move that was specifically, they gave us finally some data, because that's the biggest problem. We never get the data of what happened, but some fantastic data about 80% uplift on conversion as a result of a program of usability testing that supported their mobile redesign. So yeah, there is more and more information.
Well, thanks. I'll have a look.
Cool. Any other questions? Anybody else got any questions?
You mentioned that it's better to get something right earlier rather than trying to change it later on. but you know, what's happening on a lot of websites now is everybody's in constant change. They're constantly tweaking what they've got. And so how do you fit this kind of testing, user testing, into that constant stream of there's a change every day or every week?
I guess it really depends on the size of the organization. Yeah, Paul, over to you. I'll let you answer that.
I think it's a really good question, actually. So the vast majority of work we do actually is in the discovery stage and in the through to the prototyping stage. And actually, when something's live, really talking about sort of optimization and evolution. And I think we do a fair amount of testing. They're probably about 20% of the work we do there. But it is fair to say that what we do then is kind of a deep dive that sits over often the kind of tech stack that a client will have around optimization, and that will use some of the things like Hotjar, Google Analytics, on-site surveys, lots of other ways of getting feedback about how the interface is evolving. So a program of research can support that quite well, but what we tend to find is that at that stage, it may be a customer will do maybe something every time they do a major change, or maybe once a year just to check that things are going okay, because the qualitative data is very, very rich. It gives a lot of actions, and that supports neatly the quantitative that's coming through everything else.
What you might also find as well is that a lot of these organizations, a lot of these changes are actually driven by user research and driven by testing. So actually, a good example is there's a technique called within user experience testing. Well, this is more the sort of the testing and prototyping part, but you'll hear of A/B testing or multivariate testing. Basically, very, very similar things. A/B is testing two versions of the same thing. Multivariate is basically testing multi versions of the same thing. But to make that live in the real world, so the Gov website, the main government website in the UK, was quite famously overhauled. It was a really good, strong piece of kind of overhaul about 8-9 years ago, back in around about 2012, 2013-ish, I think. Their approach to it was actually fantastic. It was a really good case study about they brought in an internal design team, and the person who headed it up, I forget the guy's name, but he was very, very much focused on the user experience. And a famous example I always remember was they had a page. You would go through and do something on the Gov website like renew your passport, and then at the end they wanted to also kind of cross-sell like I think blood donation, like donating blood. So they had this page at the end of the passport application process, whatever it was, and they created 8 different versions, which is classic multivariate testing. And the way you have to go about that is quite specific. So you can't, because there are so many variables that can affect the effectiveness of something. Multivariate is quite good because if you imagine if you wanted to test 8 different versions of a key page, i.e. the layout and positioning, if you did them concurrently, you launch one, tested it, then launch the next one, tested it, then launch the next one, tested it. The problem you've got is there are factors that may influence the decision. So for example, you could have bad weather versus good weather. You could have a positive news, positive environment versus a bad environment, economic, social, whereas multivariate testing is very good because it's a technology that you put onto a website where basically you're actually splitting the traffic in real time. So you're reducing the variations, you're reducing the variables that can affect the input. So you're getting a much purer response where actually you might have 8 versions of that page running at the very same time. You literally split the traffic into 8 streams, each one going to different pages. And then they recorded, right, so of these 8 different layouts, 8 different designs, which one got the most signups. And that will then give them the winner. So they go, right, but they then even go even further, go, right, well, this one of the first 8, this was a clear winner. But now we're going to break it off and do 8 more variations. And they can keep doing that. And what you tend to find is in terms of, the value of it is obviously harder to sell to smaller organizations because they haven't got the budget, but you'll tend to find bigger organizations lend themselves, like, when you're an entity like Amazon, the world's leading sort of e-commerce platform, you're making billions and billions of dollars probably a day, let alone a year. small changes can make a huge difference, and that's where the organisations like that will see the value in it. A small plumber with changing his form probably not going to add that much value. It's going to be pretty hard sell for him. So yeah, hopefully that kind of helps to answer a bit. Any more questions? Cool. There's quite a lot to take in, quite a big session, but hopefully you guys all found that useful. So I guess it's pretty much time to kind of wrap everything up, really. So you can see on screen contact details for myself and Paul if you do want to get in contact and ask any questions after the session. Again, there's the link for the feedback survey, our Survey Monkey. Please do take the time to feedback. And upcoming events. So there are upcoming events obviously coming up in the near future. You can see the upcoming meetups on the meetup page. You can see the URL there. Apart from that, again, thanks everyone for coming, and yeah, we hope you enjoyed this session. We'll hopefully see you again soon.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed that.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Paul.